Tropic Dunes.
Okay, so what happened?
Should we get the drum roll? No,
Yeah.
I'm just kidding.
Okay.
What does
So-
he call him? What does he call him, Linda?
The Egyptian. The
All right,
Egyptian.
so let's get into that. That's what everybody's here for. Let's just face it, okay? That's what we're all here for.
Okay.
Go ahead. No, really
Okay.
talk to us about this. This is fascinating. So it's very unconventional. I'll hand it over to you, and I will zip my lips for about like.
No, you can interrupt me. You're free to interrupt me. Okay, so remember I said all these things I put aside like you do, and I'm a scientist by training. When something doesn't fit, the thing you should do is stop and think. But that's not what people do. They dismiss. This is, look at the Russians watching Russian television now. If something doesn't fit what Putin says, they dismiss it. This is how the human mind works. So I dismissed all these things that were, hey, why are the robbers coming up at the late 40s when they should be there in the year 36? Why were there no crucifixions? Why is this guy Theodos mentioned in the 40s in Josephus, but in the 30s in the New Testament? They kept heaping up all these time shifts that were really, really strange. In any event, there was one guy. So I told you that Josephus talks about a lot of messianic leaders, and the messianic leaders are rebels, because this is the era when the Jews rebel against the Roman Empire, because they've been occupied, right? And the rebellion is always led by religious figures. It's a religious and physical rebellion. So the messianic leaders are always rebel leaders, and vice versa. Most often, it goes together. They're fighting for the religion. So he said, all these messianic, but he names a few. He names a few, just a handful. And one of the ones he names is called the Egyptian. And let me just read. He writes about him at length, and he writes about him in both his major works, The Jewish War and Jewish Antiquities. And I'll just read one of them, okay?
Oh, you found it. Great. All right.
Okay. So this is what Josephus writes about the Egyptian. And the Egyptian appears under procurator, not Pilate, but Felix. And Felix was the procurator between 52 and 59 AD, approximately. So, 20 years after Jesus was said to be crucified, okay? So this is one of his texts. I quote, "There came out of Egypt about this time to Jerusalem one that said he was a prophet, and advised the multitude of the common people to go along with him to the Mount of Olives, as it was called, which lay over against the city and at the distance of 5 furlongs. He said further that he would show them from hence how, at his command, the walls of Jerusalem would fall down, and he promised them that he would procure them an entrance into the city through those walls when they were fallen down. Now, when Felix was informed of these things, he ordered his soldiers to take their weapons and came against them with a great number of horsemen and footmen from Jerusalem and attacked the Egyptian and the people that were with him. He also slew 400 of them and took 200 alive, but the Egyptian himself escaped out of the fight, but did not appear anymore. Now, if this had been written about an event in the 30s, I mean, we would, our ears would prick up, because there are a lot of similarities here, like Jesus. And there's his other text also talks about Jesus. It's much more negative, the other text he writes, and he writes about him coming in from the wilderness there. So, like Jesus, the Egyptian had lingered in the wilderness. Both speak of tearing down the walls of Jerusalem. In Luke, you read it. Both had lived in Egypt. Both are described as messianic leaders with a great following. Both are perceived as major threats by the authorities. And the Egyptian is defeated on the Mount of Olives, which is where Jesus was arrested, right? Now, there are 3 major differences between them. The first one is the time, okay? But if we look upon this time issue as, hey, there's a lot of stuff seems to be different in time, so we can put that aside for the time being. The second difference is, okay, Jesus was resting on the Mount of Olives, and the Sanhedrin, the people from the Jewish council came and arrested this resting man, right? And here there's a battle with the Roman commander sending out soldiers, and so it's and the third thing is there's no word of crucifixion. Okay, so those are the 3 differences. But what happened after I'd read about this guy, I kept thinking, oh my God, he does something, but it's the wrong time. So I had this science revelation moment that when you stop putting things aside and it just comes back and just whams you into your head. It was late at night. It was like 3 o'clock in the morning. And I was reading a translation. I don't speak Greek, but I was reading let's say an accurate translation of the original text of John describing the arrest of Jesus. Okay? And there's a difference between the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John when it comes to the description of the arrest of Jesus. Because the synoptic gospels all describe how the Jewish council, the men from the Jewish council came and arrested him, right? John says that the men from the Jewish council were accompanied by the commander and his, depending on which translation, his soldiers, his guardsmen. There were some Romans there also. But when you look at the original Greek of John, the word for those soldiers, those guardsmen, is speira, and the word for the commander is chiliarchos. A speira is a Roman cohort of 1,000 soldiers. 1,000. And chiliarchos means a leader of 1,000. This was not a few men, it was a battle, right? So when I realized that Jesus, according to John, was in a battle on the Mount of Olives, it just went holy.
Can I ask you something? I'm going to jump in because I remember this really stuck with me when I was listening to your information. Have you ever been asked, okay, well, what about Jesus, when you go to that scripture, and if you don't mind, I'm just going to go to, I think it's Matthew. Oh, no, it's John. You're talking about John 18.
Yeah.
If you don't mind me, can I just read it?
Sure. It's 1803 and 1812. I think there are two places.
Right, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll do 18:3. So Judas then, having received a band of men, that's what you're saying, which is a group of the 1,000, right? And officers from the chief priests and Pharisees coming there with lanterns and torches and weapons. And then verse 12 is, then the band and the captain and officers of the Jews took Jesus and bound him. Now, what about when Jesus says, because I was very intrigued by what you mentioned, when this is all going on and then Peter, what you said, cuts the ear off. When Jesus stops him in the story, in the narrative of the story, I know you're gonna, so I want to give it, because people have these questions. So then he says, no, don't do it, because I can call down legions to fight for me, but this isn't what we're supposed to do. So can you talk to us about that?
Right. Okay. I'm just going to say one other thing, that in Luke, it actually, Jesus is telling them to bring swords to the Mount of Olives.
Right.
Yes. He's telling them to bring swords and sell their clothes unless they have swords. I find, now that I'm looking at it through this lens, I find the New Testament to be one of the most intriguing, elaborate mazes, labyrinths. It's amazingly cleverly written. Amazing. This is not the only time when Jesus says the opposite of what he, if Josephus is correct, and this is the same person, would say. There are other places where the story is almost the same, but instead of saying, okay, cut them down, he says, no, put down your swords. So, and this comes, it's the same, I mean, there's several places like this where people are doing one thing if you look at it through the lens of Josephus, and Jesus says the opposite. Now, I have to, this makes me need to address the issue of why would you shift it in time at all? Because we have to get to that eventually. So why would anybody want it if this is a real shift in time that is done in the New Testament from the 50s to the 30s? And I just want to tell you, it's not like there's one thing, it's not like there's two things. It's like when you look at it in the 30s, there is not one single parallel. There are names, but they don't do the same things. There's not one single parallel. If you move it to the 50s, it's a slew of parallels, but with one significant difference. The parallels, if you look at them in Josephus, they're all violent. It's rebel activity. It's a fight with knives. If you look at the same texts, when you look at these parallels, if you accept them as parallels and you look at them in the New Testament, they're mostly, but not all the time, pacifistic. So, not all the time, because the New Testament lets through these bursts, like when Jesus tells the disciples to bring swords. Why would he tell them to bring swords to the Mount of Olives? And another thing is, the New Testament names every single first century rebel leader for no reason whatsoever. They just throw the names in. So I remember what I said, that when history and religion collides, religion wins, but the true history is always under the surface. Okay? And why would they move it from the 50s to the 30s? If this is true, which I believe it is, I can think of only one single reason, and that is that Josephus, and there were other historians that we no longer have, like Justus of Tiberias, but Josephus, he was not a small, insignificant guy. He was really important in his own time. He was brought by Emperor Titus to Rome. His books were published and deposited in the Library of Rome. He had even a statue erected to him. If you were going to describe the same people as Josephus was describing, you'd have to compete with him, and he does not like these people, okay?
Okay.
He
Okay.
does not
May I
like
ask-
people.
Right, you did mention that. Let me ask you a question. I don't know if I'm the first one asking you this. The Egyptian. Could it be possible, because of the time, which would fit with Simon the Magus, or what did you say? You said you mentioned Theodos. Could it be possible that the Egyptian could also be compared to Simon Magus, because he also was a leader? And did you ever consider that other people besides Jesus could be? Have you ever been
Besides the
asked that?
Egyptian. Besides the
Yeah.
Egyptian. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people have compared the Jesus, because he doesn't exist, as is in Josephus. People have compared him to a lot of different individuals. There's a number of them, and I'm not the only one who's using a shift in time idea.
But why Jesus?
I am looking at all
Let me
of
ask
it.
you.
Yeah.
1 second. Did you look at Simon Magus?
I did.
He really does fit.
I did.
Fit
I
that
did.
Jesus thing. I mean, not the Jesus, the Egyptian. Tell us about that. Like,
No,
did you
but
look at
listen,
him?
I'm not, it's a long time ago that I wrote about it, and it's a long time ago that I looked at Simon Magus. I did look at it, but you would have to remind me of where you see the similarities for me to address it.
Okay, well, what, like, for instance, he heard the story of Jesus from the apostles. He followed Philip. He followed him there were the Gospels of Philip found in the Nag Hammadi. So Philip was in Egypt. He was a disciple of Philip, and he also died. He was around in first century, like 50, from like 40 to 54. He was a god. He led a great group of men. So I just those little things, because I really love the idea. But then I started thinking, well, possibly could this be not just Simon, but there were many disciples who loved this idea of Jesus, and they just started, maybe picking up whatever, speed or steam. Talk to us about that possibility.
Okay, so this is my reading in general, that Josephus is not doing quizzes. He's not doing riddles, but the New Testament is. And so sometimes in the New Testament, one person appears as several different people. So, for instance, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Christ, may well be the same person. When you look at the historical sources, there are indications they may be the same person. I'll give you another example. Remember that the third thing that differentiates the Egyptian from Jesus is that he wasn't crucified there's no mention of him being crucified in Josephus, okay? Now, when Jesus is crucified, remember the story of what happens, okay? So there's a choice. He's crucified between two robbers, but there's a robber leader, a rebel leader, who's also supposed to be crucified, Barabbas, right? But he's like, they say, should we crucify Barabbas or should we crucify Jesus? And they choose Jesus. So Jesus is crucified, and Barabbas escapes without being crucified, right? Now, what does Barabbas mean? It means Bar-Abbas, son of the Father, right? Now in Matthew, what is Barabbas called? Jesus Barabbas. So they say, so the question is, should we crucify Jesus or should we crucify Jesus, son of the Father?
Yeah.
Okay?
That's interesting.
So here you have the riddle again, okay? Mm-hmm. Of course, he could be a separate person, but it is a little weird that his name is Jesus, son of the Father. Okay, so yes,
there's something to that, right?
Yes, so I do think that the New Testament is written like a quiz, and so I do think the same person does appear as several different people, and it may well be. I'm not read up on Simon Magus right now, so I can't I can't discuss it with you because I remember reading it and thinking, no, there are too many differences. But I don't remember now. So it may well be that there are similarities. But I want to bring up another one because it's so cleverly written. And that night when I read this Wham thing that came in, and that there was a whole army meeting Jesus on the Mount of Olives. The one thing that's just got into my head and scared the hell out of me, frankly, was Acts 21 verse 38.
Okay.
Because remember what led me into this was, could Jesus and Paul be the same person?
Right.
Okay. Now the Egyptian, like all the rebel leaders, are mentioned in the New Testament. They're named. Mm-hmm. All the major rebel leaders are there from the first century.
The Egyptian is in the. Oh, really? Tell us where is the Egyptian?
Let me. I think I can maybe find it here, and I'll read it to you exactly.
That's interesting.
Okay.
Because I was looking for something in there. I didn't see anything.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to read you a section. This is. I'll read it. It'll take a minute, but this is Acts of the Apostles, chapter 21. Paul, who, got his revelation on the road to Damascus, he comes back to Jerusalem a few times, but he's really not welcomed there, right? They really try to get him out of there. And then he decides to show himself in the temple, okay? He comes several times, and then one time he goes there for the last time, and he goes to the temple. And remember, this is some time after the crucifixion of Jesus, obviously. So I'm going to read to you Acts. The whole city was in a turmoil, and people came running from all directions. They seized Paul and dragged him out of the temple, and at once the doors were shut. They were bent on killing him. I mean, why? Why would they kill him? So they are really angry. The people at the temple are really angry at Paul. Why would they be so angry? So they were bent on killing him, but word came to the officer commanding the cohort that all Jerusalem was in an uproar because of Paul, right? The commander immediately took a force of soldiers with their centurions and came down at the double to deal with the riot. When the crowd saw the commandant and his troops, they stopped beating Paul. As soon as the commandant could reach Paul, he arrested him and ordered him to be shackled with 2 chains. He inquired who he was and what he had been doing. Some in the crowd shouted one thing, some another. And as the commander could not get at the truth because of the hubbub, he ordered him to be taken to the barracks. When Paul reached the steps, he found himself carried up by the soldiers because of the violence of the mob. For the whole crowd was at their heels yelling, "Kill him!" Just before he was taken into the barracks, Paul said to the commandant, "May I have a word with you?" The commandant said, "So you speak Greek? Are you then not the Egyptian who some time ago created turmoil and together with the 4,000 Sicarii went out into the wilderness?"
So wouldn't that's very, I'm glad you showed me that.
He's saying to Paul, remember he's reversing all the time, are you then not the Egyptian? Meaning, are you that? That's what the crowd told him, obviously. It's the Egyptian, kill him. Okay? So they're saying Paul is the Egyptian. But
I don't want to interrupt, but I just want to ask you, because I'm just going to jump in and out. But wouldn't that be closer to Simon Magus than Jesus himself?
What would
Wouldn't
be-
that be more like during that time was the time when Simon Magus comes on the scene and Jesus is long gone? What I'm wondering is, because I mean, this is very intriguing. I just want to pick your brain on what leads you to go to Jesus more than to go to someone like Simon Magus, or who's actually mentioned in Acts and could possibly be this Egyptian, this notorious Egyptian mentioned of, right? Why would that be Jesus?
No, I mean, the parallel that I draw to Jesus is the stories from Josephus of the Egyptian coming to the Mount of Olives and fighting and all. I mean, that's the story that makes it so similar to Jesus, right?
Okay.
So I mean, that's sort of, you know, we've already established the similarities between the Egyptian and Jesus, but we have not. Now, remember, I came to this with a thought, could Jesus and Paul be the same person? But what is so clever here is that they bypass Jesus and makes the connection between the Egyptian and Paul. Because if they had said, are you then not Jesus? Then Jesus would have been Paul, right? So they say, are you then not the Egyptian? So
that would have worked for all of us, right?